I'm delighted we've got four really good, excellent panelists and a terrible moderator. We have John Laird, furthest over to my left, your right, who's Secretary of the Resources Agency for the state of California. Delighted to have him here today. Xavier Irias, who's the Chief Engineer from East Bay Municipal Utility District, bringing sort of a utility perspective. And then we have Rex Hime and Lucy Dunn. Rex is with the California Business Properties Association, located in Southern California, I believe, or Sacramento. Here. Sacramento. He's wearing that Southern California shirt, I thought. And then Lucy
How many
Dunn.
think this is only for Southern California? Raise your hand. See?
Those of you that are paying close attention will notice that from the pictures she had of me in the beginning that I only own one tie. And then Lucy Dunn is with the Orange County Business Council. So I'm really delighted that we have four really distinguished people representing state perspectives on this issue, utility perspectives on this issue, and a little different private sector views on this issue. And what we'll do, I'll start off with sort of 4 questions. Hopefully we'll get through all 4 questions and then save some time at the end for audience Q&A. And we'll have each panelist respond to each question. The first question is, what are the biggest vulnerabilities you see to water supplies in California? And we'll start with Lucy Dunn.
Yikes. Okay.
So she's just in time here.
Just in time. Probably from the business community standpoint, I think one of the biggest vulnerabilities to water supplies is just educating the general public. I love that cartoon up on the slide that was presented on people that don't have a sense, especially in Southern California with 2/3 of the state's population. Overwhelmingly, they don't understand where their water comes from and that the delta is a critical component to that. So I think it's a huge vulnerability when you don't have an educated public, and I'll share with you that for the last 10 years we've done a phenomenal job trying to just move the needle so that in Southern California they even know what the delta is, and we've had some success there, I have to admit. So I say that sort of tongue-in-cheek, but if you don't have education, if you don't have a basic understanding of what the problem is, you can't even move them to solutions. And so I find that to be an amazing vulnerability. Second, of course, is an earthquake. What do we have? Like a 99% chance, according to USGS, that we're going to have an earthquake in Southern California within the next 30 years of significance. And in Northern California, I think the statistics are 97%. So knowing that an earthquake is coming, it's a major vulnerability to our system. Major drought, obviously, is the big issue. And then a vulnerability that perhaps we haven't focused on in the PowerPoint presentation in the report, a vulnerability when you're talking about pricing of water that I think we need to look at is AB 32 and the costs of implementing AB 32 and greenhouse gas reductions that are also going to apply to water deliverers. And so when you're talking about costs of a system that the public doesn't yet understand, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, in particular, the canary in the coal mine on water costs and an educated public might be like what Golden State Water Company, a private purveyor, is doing right now, where I've got some of our neighborhoods in Orange County have experienced $200 per month water bills. And they are storming the PUC, and this is a private water purveyor that doesn't perhaps have the subsidies or the largesse of a public agency, but they're actually trying to get their customers to pay for the infrastructure and upgrades that they need. Now add greenhouse gas requirements on top of that, as well as to our public agencies. So I think those are my top vulnerabilities that I see from the business standpoint.
Thank you. Rex?
I would agree with the ones you've outlined, Lucy. I'd add also that the whole concept of planning and preparation. I don't think the state, and when you see that we're spending as little as we are on planning for meeting these contingencies or making the preparations to meet with an emergency, et cetera, I think that leaves us at risk I have to say for a moment here that when Ellen said back in the 20th century, I actually cringed because I lived there. And
I think your shirt's from there.
Wow. Okay,
Speaking of vulnerabilities.
If you want to make it everything fair game, we can do that too. I do want to comment that for those of us who've been around quite a while, seeing a California Journal reference was very meaningful. They used to be quite the journal for all of us who paid attention to stuff. But in today's world, that's become PPIC. So I want to thank them for doing what they're doing and making a continuing difference in our world.
In terms of vulnerabilities, first I would agree so that I don't have to repeat everything with what Lucy and Rex said, but I think if I had to say what are the top three, it would be earthquakes, drought, and climate change. And I do think earthquake belongs at the top of that list, but I wouldn't ignore the others. I always wonder whether the next drought we see is going to be aware that it's supposed to follow something we call the drought planning sequence. I have a feeling it hasn't been briefed on that. So it's easy to make a plan and to do a lot of modeling, and we do tons of modeling to see how well we could withstand a drought. Based on that modeling, we make big investments. But I think we need to recognize the limits of a model, and the next drought could very well exceed our expectations. And climate change, of course, adds to that. I think when you look at a PowerPoint show about climate change, sometimes it could lead you to a false sense of security because most of them talk about averages. They say, well, this is what we think the average is going to be. Even if you believe that, and even if it looks kind of bad and you say, well, okay, we have to do something, I think the really big deal with climate change would be the increased uncertainty and the increased variability. And that would be the real game changer potentially. And you add that to what you thought a drought was. And that could leave you seeing high levels of what we now call stress on a more frequent basis. So I wouldn't write those off. But I did say, well, earthquake belongs at the top of the list. And I think that's because after the earthquake, we probably will all in this room define our lives really as life before the earthquake and life after the earthquake. I think it literally will be, for people that are near it, a life-changing event. And on the magnitude of, say, the 1906 earthquake was, for those people that made it through that. That's not to say it'll be the same as 1906 by any means. I think 1906 was dominated by the fire. And I think there's very strong evidence that fire is not going to be as dominant in the next big earthquake. And that's not just made up. If you look at fire following earthquake for the last 100 years, there is, I think, a pretty steady decline, particularly in the more kind of first world countries where it tends to hit. Now, so that's good news, that less fire. I think the bad news about being increasingly modern when it comes to earthquake impacts is that, the higher you are, the further you have to fall. And a good example of the counterexample, Sichuan, 2008. We sent an engineer over there, and he got to take a look at how well they were recovering. And they were up to 8 liters per capita per day reasonably soon following the earthquake. And for them, that was almost normal. And that's our problem, is 8 liters per capita per day, of course. We probably waste a lot more than that, each of us individually every day. Our level of demand is very high. Our tolerance for interruption is very low. The opposite of a place like China, so you might say, well, they were so primitive to begin with that when everything broke, well, it really wasn't that big a deal. So what if you have to boil the water? They boil the water anyway. So what if you don't have water for sanitation? They don't have that anyway. We have all those things. We have an industry and a society that really depend on it. They depend on it 24/7. So in a sense, I think we do have a pretty far way to fall when that earthquake hits. That's why I think I'd rate it at the top in terms of vulnerabilities. Thank you.
It's actually very interesting to hear the before earthquake and after earthquake, because as somebody that was a leader of Santa Cruz at the time of the 1989 earthquake, where we lost 60% of the square footage in our core downtown area during that, and our downtown was closed for 2 years, and we discovered that among the pipes below downtown were redwood pipes that had been there since before the 1906 earthquake. I've already lived in the before and the after of an earthquake and date time from that, and it's this peculiar sense that we're just living in a bubble. It could happen tomorrow, and how are we ready? And I think that naturally then also growing up politically in Santa Cruz, I will be more ethereal because I think that the reliability issues are a complacency and inability to make a decision. Those are the reliability issues right now. And because if you look at some of the original literature of California and you realize that before Europeans arrived in California, the water in the state supported a population of 250,000 people. So the difference between that and now is the infrastructure that we have developed. And it is an infrastructure we rely on that is old, relies on, as Ellen was saying, different kinds of water rights, all different kinds of things that sort of lead us to the point that we know that there are incredible vulnerabilities in the system, but the question is do we have the capacity to actually address them? And we have to. And I think that's what the rest of the panel will be about.
Jay, if I could, I want to make sure that Xavier understood when I was talking about planning. It was actually in the means of how do we deal with restructuring the Delta after the earthquake happens. Do we have the equipment? Where are we going to get the materials that are going to be needed to rebuild it? That kind of stuff. I don't think we've done any of that yet either. So,
we'll move on to the second question. How important are these vulnerabilities, the vulnerabilities of floods and droughts and earthquakes and indecision? I was glad to see that one added. To the economy, particularly in the different sectors you are working in, and how much do these vulnerabilities affect long-term economic decisions, location decisions for businesses and households? Let's start again with Lucy.
Well, a human being can live without water for what, 10 days? So to have, is that what it is?
Maybe a day.
Maybe a
or two. I mean, it's very short.
when you're from Southern California.
Southern California. In Southern California, a human being can live without water for 10 days.
Don't tell them any different.
I know. It is interesting in the vulnerability standpoint, and I'll give you an example in Orange County. I know, for example, that in northern Orange County there are some groundwater supplies, and in fact I think it's something like 80% of Orange County's water come from groundwater in northern Orange County. 20% might be from Metropolitan Water District. In South Orange County, there are 3 days at the end of a broken pipeline, and there's no water. It's a desert. I mean, that literally is what you saw some of the slides that Ellen showed. It's a desert. And so the vulnerabilities, again, are apparent. I just saw South Orange County build a gigantic new water reservoir at the end of our 241 toll road so that it increases those 3 days to like 10 days. But it is an interesting dynamic. It's a critically important issue. Do I think businesses are thinking about that when they relocate to the state? No. I don't think that it's on the top of their list. They just presume that Southern California is dynamic. Orange County has the lowest unemployment rate in the state. That's the place where you want to go locate your business if you're going to come to a highly overregulated state like California is, or in Silicon Valley where there's money and capital and all the tech companies are there. So they think about California as we'll take the overregulation, we'll take the vulnerabilities, we'll take all the downside because the market is so big here that we'll take the risk. So from a business standpoint, there's other things to think about with regard to the state as a whole from a vulnerability standpoint. But the reality is, I think that's what's important about the business community stepping up and being educated and trying to teach our different industry clusters to be aware of what's happening, not just in front of them on how to add shareholder value, but lift their heads up from a corporate social responsibility component to see what's happening around them that could impact their shareholder value in the future. And I think that's one of the jobs of the Orange County Business Council, Silicon Valley Leadership Group, and a number of our major statewide associations is to educate them on that higher order. That's you, Rex.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rick.
Everything you said, great. I think this is also where we go a little bit to the discussion that the LAO gentleman raised. Because while the businesses that are locating here, and God bless them, there aren't that many, by the way, while businesses are locating here and they're not thinking about the supply not going to be there, in order to build the facilities that they're going to be in, whether they be in the Silicon Valley or whether they be down in Southern California, you have to show that water supply. And I think that is going to become much more difficult to do. That water supply, by the way, is much more important, and I'm not trying I'm not going to cast aspersions upon my fellow home builders, but for home builders, they build homes and they move on. For commercial folks, you build the property and you want to own it. You're going to own it forever. So those 20 years is a very meaningful threshold because you're planning on being around 20 years from now. The homeowners, the home builders know that the homeowners are going to be faced with that problem should it develop in 20 years. But having said that, being able to make sure that the water districts and that the local governments are making the right appropriate judgments is really important. I believe that we're going to see a lot more challenges when the economy starts to turn around, and there will be a resurgence of building and construction. There are those in this state who are very happy that we have less people working today than we did 5 years ago. And they are going to want to continue that particular level of employment and growth. So water is a huge tool in the economic world of allowing California to grow. And when one looks at the economy of California, it has really always been about growth. It's one of the main streams of our economic growth and GDP.
So let me add one more point, because you have to always put this in context with California. There are two core values, in my opinion, that California values the most. Environmental protection. We love our open space, clean water, clean air. It's one of our key assets is environmental protection. And the second core value in California that no one talks about is we love sex. I've got your attention, right?
Don't say anything, John.
Yeah, I was leaning to the
I've got your attention.
I wanted to know how water intensive this was.
I'm going to connect the dots for you, baby. Since 1950, the state of California has grown 500,000 people every single year. Since 1950, it's a straight line. It's the only thing about this damn state that's predictable is population growth, which is why I say sex is a core value. Yes, it used to be immigration. Actually, we're sort of down a little bit now because we actually have more out-migration than in-migration now, so it's a little bit off. But it's más o menos about 500,000 a year. And when people talk about water and growth, and I've heard this so often it drives me mad, that increasing water supplies and water reliability is growth-inducing, the only thing I know is that sex is growth-inducing. And therefore, if we do not plan for our growth will plan us. And that is a key takeaway, ladies and gentlemen, that we need to remember. If we're not building a single house, we're still making people that we have a duty to take care of and provide a reliable water system, supplies, choices, affordability, innovation, new technology for that growing population. And the growth aspect is, yes, a growing economy means that our quality of life is able to be maintained at a level that we love and return California to the golden state we love. But do not be fooled that as we all get emotional about when the building industry comes back and now we can start opposing development again, we're still making babies and our families are not leaving. They're doubling and tripling up in existing product. And that means we need water just as much as if we were actually building houses to accommodate better houses, greener houses, more efficient houses, houses closer to jobs, and all that good stuff that we have planned for under SB 375. But never forget the fact that our population has grown predictably since 1950, and that's why your work here is so important.
Thank you, Lucy. Can I ask you a quick question? Everybody who was born in California, raise your hand.
All the rest of us go home?
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, how important are the vulnerabilities? The one that I focused on was earthquake. I do think the vulnerabilities exposed by the earthquake, they are vitally important. Years ago, East Bay Mud did a study thinking about how much should we invest in pre-earthquake kind of hardening of our system. And at that time, we were contemplating a $200 million improvement program, and we found out that the economic benefit to the region of doing that work was somewhere between $2 and $3 billion. In other words, a 10-to-1 payoff for doing some mitigations. So I think there is huge vulnerability if you don't do protective measures. Even if you have done some of those protective measures, hardening your system, planning for the worst, there will be a huge economic impact. As far as how much do those vulnerabilities affect people's decision making, my impression is not very much at the household level. That most people are not adequately prepared because they've really underappreciated how much hazard they're exposed to. And even people that you would think would really be on top of it, like hospitals, it's I would say pretty spotty. We have 18 hospitals in our service area. Years ago, we reached out to every one of them. We went through a lot of detail about, here are your vulnerabilities. We can't guarantee 24/7 service after an earthquake. And case by case, we looked at each one. How much water do you use? How much would you need after the earthquake? And in general, I'd say maybe half the hospitals had a pretty good handle on it. The other half really grossly underestimated their reliance on water. And this has been backed up by other research. There was a journal article in AWWA a few years ago that said, yeah, in general, even hospitals, they're highly vulnerable, and half of them don't know it. But I think there is some hope. We did get some interesting calls over the last year from one of the few growth areas in our service area of industry. In general, industry is declining. That's been true for decades now in our service area, where industry is leaving and or they're just using less water, and it's hard to say which. But one of the growth areas in industry is biotech. And what they surprised us with is if they have an interruption in water service, even for, say, an hour or 2 hours, it's a huge deal for them. They don't have on-site storage. They rely on very consistent, not only quantity, but quality. And it's a very disproportionate impact. It's not like, say, petrochemical, where it's a high cost per hour to be out of water, but it's proportional to that outage. In biotech, it's very disproportional. If you sever their connection for a few hours, they may have lost 6 months' worth of work. So there can be a huge lingering impact. And that was an eye-opener for us. So they aren't even thinking earthquakes. Things like nuisance main leaks that we have to take the main out for a few hours and patch something. That's a big deal to them, and that was kind of news to us. So I do think there is maybe a growing vulnerability. If we're successful in bringing in some of those industries like biotech, with it comes that vulnerability.
Thank you very much, Secretary Laird.
If you take the way I answered the first question and apply it to the vulnerabilities in the second, really, I mean, it's what are the consequences make the vulnerabilities by the inability to decide. And there are two obvious ones in the Delta, which is habitats will continue to crash in a way that might be irreparable, and loss of water supply or loss of reliable water supply will happen with the inability to make those decisions. And I enjoyed the last panel and some of these discussions because some of the issues that have come up. It was mentioned about the Silicon Valley, and I think frequently, if anybody thinks of the State Water Project, they think, oh, that's Central Valley, San Joaquin Valley, South or Southern California. They don't realize that the Santa Clara Water District gets half of its water from the Delta. Mm-hmm. If there is a drought, or more accurately, when there is a drought, it could be 80 to 90% of what is in Silicon Valley will come from the Delta. And so that is an incredible connection business-wise. If there's an interruption for 2 or 3 years of the Delta water supply due to inaction, that will have incredible consequences everywhere, but particularly in the Silicon Valley. And I think that part of what was discussed too, the Show Me the Water putting on my former hat as a legislator that represented a particular area in the Central Coast, I used to go crazy when people would talk about the Show Me the Water bill because it would not have applied to my district. There will not be a development of 500 or more in that district in my lifetime. So there is no Show Me the Water requirement in that area based on that bill. It is only whether there's large-scale development. And then there's the 20-year link with the other bill. And I think the vulnerability that relates to Los Angeles is if the 20-year supply is a requirement, over time, how do you deal with that in Los Angeles if you're relying on the Colorado River where there's been a drought for a decade, if you rely on the Delta, where unless we have a successful project in habitat restoration with the dual goals, it will only be declining as a source. How do you guarantee anywhere in Los Angeles at the micro level that you will have water at the macro level? That is going to be a hard determination. And the other thing with regard to Los Angeles is that if you look at, despite the fact that there's rampant sex and all these additional people per year, if you look at the growth in the LA basin of 3 million people in the last generation, it has been done on the same amount of water. Correct. And as a result, the efficiency is what has accounted for the growth, but efficiency ups the need for reliability because they have really dealt with conservation that's on the margin, and they really are at the nut of what they need in water, and there's less ability to conserve in the time of a drought or significant interruption. So that is a vulnerability that comes from the success of what we've wanted.
Great. Thank you very much. On to the third question. Now that we've identified the vulnerabilities and discussed what they mean, what are the most promising solutions for addressing some of these vulnerabilities? And in particular, given sort of the policy audience for this work and this audience here, what are the relative roles of state, federal, and local governments and the business sector in implementing the kinds of solutions you think are the most promising? Start with Lucy.
Okay.
Always have to start with her. She's got the best opening line.
Oh my gosh, I'm under such pressure. This one's interesting for me. I wrote, my notes are here that most important solutions are water efficiency, reuse, storage. We've got lots of great examples in Orange County. Secretary Laird shared our groundwater replenishment system. Some folks call it showers to flowers. Some people call it toilet to tap. Whatever moniker you want to call it, the reality is we're able to reuse water, and that innovation is actually now being used throughout, discussed throughout the world. So it's kind of a cool thing. I worry that landscaping still accounts for half of all urban water use. When you're trying to reuse water, that doesn't make sense to me. But it's one of those things, we do like our green grasses. I really think that some of the solutions, particularly with government, again, putting things in context, in the business community, we hear every day education needs billions of dollars. Infrastructure, the transportation infrastructure, statewide needs assessment just came out, $300 billion. Affordable housing with the demise of redevelopment needs billions of dollars. Supportive home care services, billions of dollars. I mean, everybody needs millions, billions, gazillions of dollars right now, and water's no different. They need funding in order to make some of these solutions happen. But I think funding is the third leg of the stool, and the first two legs that we haven't really talked about from a government standpoint, at least haven't taken action on. There's been talk, but are reforms and innovations. So if we do reform, innovation, and then ask our public for funding, we have better opportunity for outcomes that are measurable and accountability to come back and then say, see, public, we did this, so could you then give us more? We've got water bonds where there wasn't a lot of water in them. There was a lot of land acquisition in them, and I know because I was behind one of them. So I know the political games of some water bonds. We're very supportive of getting this water bond on the ballot because of the fact that we do know that there is some real water in there. There's also politics, but that's the nature of doing deals. But I would really love to see more talk about some system reforms in a state where everybody has a veto power. I mean, everybody says no. It's that, that system frozen that can't make a decision. Even if it's a risk, just make a decision and move forward and take that next step. The reform in the process needs to be there. And innovations are critically important. We've got a desal that 10 years ago you would all say to me is not cost effective, the water's too expensive, it'll never work. Well, it's up and running, and we've got plants up and down the state being planned. It's not a complete system solution, but there's a big ocean out there, and it's a solution. It's an innovative technology that needs to be looked at as well. So I think that, for me, are some of the things that are most promising are looking at those opportunities in government for reforms. What is the technology today that we have? We're not, my example, Art Leahy, CEO of LA Metro, huge transportation agency, 9 million people trying to move goods and people throughout Southern California. He called me one day out of the blue and he said, I'm on the train and I'm crossing over the Santa Ana River and I'm seeing all this water flush out to the ocean. Why don't you people capture more of it? What's wrong with you? The technology today for capturing water is not as good as it's going to be in 10 years. And there is some argument to be made that maybe we don't have as much of a water supply issue as we think if we could capture the water that we know goes into the ocean. I know even down in Southern California, the Prado Dam has been an interesting battle between the Army Corps of Engineers and our water folks and our environmental community. In the Prado Dam, the Army Corps of Engineers' design of the dam system in Southern California is flood protection. That's our job, floods. And the water agency says, I know, but you've got some storage capability there. Why don't you let the water level rise a bit so that we can store more water behind the dam? Nope, our job is floods, and if we store it too high, there's a flood risk. And so negotiating that, and then to have all the critters live in front of the dam, so if you let water go out, you have the environmental issues there too. So some interesting dialogues and discussions that need to take place under reform, innovation, and then let's do funding for outcomes and accountability. And that's my opinion, and I'm sticking to it.
Thank you.
That was all really nice stuff. I think I'm going to change the tenor here a little bit and start throwing spaghetti against the wall. And some of the spaghetti people are going to like, and some of it people are going to like. First and foremost, I hope John likes this. One of the dams we need to deal with is the Shaughnessy Dam. I think we need to take that dam down. I think we need to restore that valley, move the dam further down so that San Francisco will still have their water supply, and the mayor will still have $6 million of graph every year to deal with. But I think, as an environmentalist, you should be committed to something like that, and I would like to see that as part of the administration's efforts to move forward.
Because we don't have enough grief already.
You don't have enough. The governor has done something very unique, and that is there's that old saying, no man is an island. The governor has totally disproved that. He's been able to propose a budget, to his credit, that says we're going to balance cuts and we're going to balance in tax increases. And the Republicans hate the tax increases, love the cuts. The Democrats hate the cuts, love the tax increases. He's standing out there all by himself trying to direct traffic, but nobody's moving. And it's really sad. But anyway, some other things. Lucy was saying we don't have we waste a lot of water. Water just sort of flows in. To do something about that, that means you've got to start making and building storage.
Yay!
Storage is a huge issue, but it certainly is a solution to a lot of issues. One of the charts we saw up there was the chart of in year 2090. I will not be here, shirt or not. But in 2090, they're saying that potentially we will have lost a substantial portion of our water storage, which is up there in the Sierras, because of greenhouse gases and global warming. What are we doing about that, folks? And the second part of that was we're not really sure what kind of impact there will be in the rains. Well, some people say we'll have the same amount of rains and moisture drop, but it'll be at different times of the year. It'll be spread throughout. But nobody knows. Nobody knows. And water storage is an issue that you can't decide to change directions overnight in. So either you're going to say in 2090 we will have lost 50% of our water storage in the Sierra. Where are we going to replicate that? Or you just say, forget it. I don't think we should be on the forget it side. I think we need to be planning about that. I don't see anybody doing about that. Page 7 of this great report that came out that Ellen showed us on the chart showed how much urban uses were using and how they'd leveled off, and how much agriculture uses and how they'd level off. But there was no line for how much of our water goes to environmental uses.
Right.
It would be nice to know that. I think it's a substantial amount of water. I'm not against that. I like turtles. I like fish. But I think we need to look at it. Also, you know, we do a lot to protect the delta habitat, and yet we have non-native species eating the crap out of our native species and not doing anything about that. We protect them all. Striped bass. What are we doing about that? Yeah, you know, give me a limit that says there is no size limit, and I can catch as many as I want, and guess what? That'll start controlling a non-native species. So there's a lot of things that we ought to be doing to address this, because there's not just one single answer to all of this. But we've got to be committed to storage. We've got to be committed to being realistic. We've got to be committed to making some real tough environmental choices. And there are good environmental choices, and there are some bad environmental choices, but all of them are going to be tough. And we've got to recognize that if people are going to not become, in California, a third world country, we've got to have the housing, the energy, the jobs, and the water for them. That's what we need to be doing.
Yep.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rex. Xavier.
I agree with that. I don't know if that was a campaign speech almost, but
I said I'd vote for you.
I'm not running for anything. Thank you.
I would say you could kind of divide it into, well, the promising solutions. There's a whole list of technical solutions, whether it's supply reliability solutions, like that could be storage, conservation, desal, things like that. And then the reliability aspect would be infrastructure investment. You know, at a mundane level, things like replacing an old cast iron pipe. And I think that is huge. It's billions of dollars in the state that will have to be invested. But if I think about, well, what are the biggest barriers there? I'm kind of reminded of something actually Jay Lund said at a conference we both attended a couple years ago.
Oh dear.
We were listening to someone talk about how to model all kinds of technical uncertainties. And I think the question he asked at the end, pretty insightful, which is really that human uncertainty tends to dominate. You're trying to make a plan for 100 years, you know, planning to the year 2090. We can worry about, what the snowpack will be, and we can worry about how long a certain pipe material might last and things like that. Probably bigger than all those uncertainties is, well, what are all the human actors going to do in the meantime? Because that's what I think prevents people from taking action, is this kind of a climate of uncertainty. To take one easy example, we don't really know what the state finances will be from one year to the next. We really don't know the federal finances, and it has a huge impact on us. For example, when there's a lot of paving work going on, the cities and counties, they go do their paving work. We try to make our pipe work happen in sync with that. If you're a customer, of course, that's a no-brainer. You want all of your agencies to cooperate, to make plans together, do those plans. It saves money, minimizes impacts. Well, why don't we do that? Well, one reason is because the funding sources for all those projects are highly uncertain. No one knows if they're going to have money the next year to actually do a project. They don't know if they should invest other sources because, who knows, something else may change in the political landscape, and money they invest right now could be essentially irrelevant. It's almost like waiting for things to break because you hope FEMA will fix it. And it is almost that bad.
It's like wishing for the earthquake to happen so someone will make a decision.
Right.
It's really weird.
No one wants to be the first to commit. And then when money does come, it comes kind of almost just out of left field. Okay, suddenly here's some paving money, and it's been defined as you can only do it on work that we're going to do anyway. That's what shovel-ready means. So, when the funding arrives in a very haphazard way, how can you make a 90-year plan or a 100-year plan? You really can't, and I think that's the biggest thing. My hope for all the levels of government is they provide enough of a kind of a stable planning environment. I'm assuming that my agency won't necessarily like all of the rules as far as who pays for what and what gets built, but actually even knowing what that was going to be would be a huge step in the right direction, just to have a certain and kind of as level as possible playing field so everyone can make reasonably good plans and move forward. Thank you.
I feel like I'm in a presidential debate where I have to ask what the original question was. And I can't help but comment on one thing, the comment about wait to see if FEMA will fund it, because apropos of something I said earlier, FEMA will only fund back to the original condition of what it was before it was damaged. So when we discovered redwood pipes under the street, they would only cover the replacement of the redwood. If we wish to actually do a modern pipe, that was at our expense. So if you were thinking of waiting for FEMA, don't. I think the original question was what would you actually do to address the vulnerabilities that you identified? And in my case, I really think it is come to some fundamental decision on how to move ahead against the dual goals statewide and in the Delta. That is a way to address those vulnerabilities, many ways, all the vulnerabilities. And I think we are working hard to do that, and I think we have made some progress in recent months, and it really is balancing all the interests. So you sort of take, as I'm very fond of saying, when you look at the dual co-equal goals, everybody is firmly committed to one of them. And, and yet they finally realize they can't achieve the one that they want without achieving the one that they don't care as much about. And our struggle has been, how do you take these two poles and find some overlapping area where you determine reliability within the context of dealing with the fish habitats? You build some kind of facility that can be financed, that is at a level that people will accept and will serve those other two things. And I think we are moving strongly in that direction, and it really involves some of the uncertainty that was mentioned, because I think we're going to have to spend 15 years between now and the actual completion of some facility in the Delta, working as hard as we can to restore the habitat, to know where we sort of set the level of the facility when it starts, and within some range you determine the reliability based on the fact that we have restored the habitat and you can export at a higher level, or that we haven't and you set it below, and that sort of takes the motivation of the dual goals and really forces us to deal with the habitat in a way that it determines the reliability. And I think there is a way to proceed there that could reach across a broader group of stakeholders. And then to speak to some of the things that were talked about in that regard, I love to tell the story that when I was a legislator, primarily representing two counties that imported no water, that weren't tied to the state system, I was always outraged that we would have to close schools, throw kids off health care, do all these things, pay 100% for our water, and then pay for somebody else's water on top of it. And now, as Resources Secretary, I strongly support it. And that sort of gets to the issue in many ways of storage. And you see, I still bristle a little bit at the there was no water in the previous bonds. When we talk about LA adding 3 million people on the same amount of water, it was significant bond expenditures, whether it was for recycling, integrated water management, conservation, that allowed for that to happen. And so there was fundamental water solutions in that. There just wasn't bricks and mortar storage that you could see in a major way. And I think now one of the things is that there is a shift that is underway. It's not totally there by any means, where those that really understand that they're committed to protecting or restoring the fish habitats understand that storage is a piece of that. That if you have a winter like you had last year, and that you can environmentally take a lot of extra water over any so-called average year, if you have a place to put it, that allows you to take whatever's environmentally okay the rest of the time and to even things out in purpose of reliability, that storage has a role in that. And one of the things that also used to make me crazy, because I authored all these bills, and by the way, for one moment of unbridled shamelessness, with regard to urban outdoor landscape irrigation that you mentioned.
Let me move out of the way.
Yeah. There was a legislator in the middle of the last decade that authored a bill that brought all the stakeholders together to see what they could agree upon. And then the next year there was a stakeholder process. And then the year after that there was a bill that dealt with outdoor urban landscape irrigation and required a number of things in terms of smart timers, but also the fact that every local municipality needs to have an outdoor urban landscape irrigation conservation ordinance, and if they couldn't figure out how to do one that fit them, then the state would have a model ordinance that will be imposed after a period of years on them. And so that is working, that is addressing that. Thanks to that unnamed legislator that did that. And then lastly, just for the record, Hetch Hetchy is a city project enabled by federal legislation that does not engage the state in any way, despite Rex's desperation in doing that.
But leadership can come from many different corners.
It can, but right now we're going to spend whatever capital we have on the Delta. And I think that is where the solution is, and trying to move people to.
Great. Well, thank you very much. These are very, very lively answers to these and creative answers to these questions. I would like to leave some time for audience Q&A. So there's one right back here. The next one will be over there.
Hi, my name is Brett Baker. I'm here on behalf of Central Delta Water Agency. You'll have to forgive me. I'm just a parochial farmer, so I'm going to ask some real basic general questions here. I'm having a little bit of difficulty understanding exactly what it is you're up there talking about. I was just curious if you could give me your brief explanation or thoughts on what is meant by the sentence in the SB 7X legislation of reduced future reliance on the Delta, and I was just curious if the panelists might want to expound on that.
Well, I would say reduced future reliance on the Delta means you have a conveyance which gets the water moved without it going through the Delta. I didn't know there was a wow answer, but okay.
I also think it also means a diversity of water sources helps an economy with certainty. So if one is down, you have others to rely on, which is why we're looking at conservation, reuse, desal, storage. It isn't just the Delta, although absolutely Secretary Laird is correct. So great leader in that. We do need to fix the Delta and then provide for alternative conveyance that makes sense, but a decision needs to be made. So diversity is key to water supply.
Anything else on this question?
Do you have anything you want to? One of the interesting things, just as my flip comment about everybody firmly being committed to one of the two goals. In the water package, everybody cites the thing that gives them the most comfort from it. And there are many people that talk about that particular provision about lesser reliance on the Delta. And my own take is it means that you have to, over time, bolster whatever you can in local self-reliance on water. That is really what it means over time. And yet it feeds into, as well, what I was talking about before. Because if, in fact, local self-reliance includes managing much better and conserving a limited supply, it puts pressure on the reliability of what that limited supply is. And so it is the balancing of those things. And if you are away from the Delta, it probably means conservation, recycling. I have to say there is a raging debate going on anywhere in the state, with the possible exception of Orange County, on desalting. A ballot measure was just turned in Santa Cruz. People are voting on it in other places. There's lots of issues that are still in play there. And so it is trying to do all those things. And it seems to me that when you're talking about a comprehensive solution, you talk about restoring habitat in the Delta, you talk about water reliability in the Delta, and you talk about what are some of the other things such as conservation and recycling and other things that might be away from the Delta that help the statewide water picture as well.
I just want to add very quickly, John, that as long as 20% of the water falls in the south and 80% of the population is down there and 20% of the population is up here and we get 80% of the water, there's always going to be a huge disconnect from the locals being able to ultimately provide enough water for their population, assuming we have any kind of
and I know
growth.
It's the fact that I did in my past life spent 23 years in elected office.
I know
but
that.
Also relevant is the percentage of voters below the Tehachapi's as well as north.
But the voters below the Tehachapi, just to your point, don't seem to have much of a difference because, let's see, 2 United States senators, the leader of the Democratic House, the governor, the lieutenant governor, the Attorney General, the Secretary of Education, and one other who I just am blanking on their name and forgive me, God forgive me. All of them come within 7 miles of each other from San Francisco. So despite the voters being south, the power is still in the Bay Area.
Some of the voters are thinking about seceding from the state of Northern California. And we would be happy to buy water from you because you will need our revenue.
And as long as you stay south, go ahead.
I will stay south.
And Senator Boxer anticipated the secession and moved to Rancho Mirage. So.
She knows where the cool people are.
Let's have the next question.
Okay. Doug Holland with the Assembly Republican Office of Policy. Thank you, Secretary Laird, for some of your legislation.
And that's more than you could have said for most of my colleagues.
Indeed.
I think. Yeah.
Indeed. In all of the discussion of vulnerabilities, we've heard things like earthquakes, education, AB 32, planning, and even sex. Would any of the panelists care to comment on the unmentioned, and that is judicial intervention?
I think we had some of that discussion when we were talking about 221 and 610 and the LAOS issue that they raised. I think that's a huge problem. I mean, that's certainly, I don't think any of us meant not to discuss that. I think when you have to be able to show that you have reliability, whether you're building commercial or residential projects of a certain size, I think that you have that threat of judicial intervention at any time. And certainly the laws of California go way beyond that. I mean, let's face it, no matter what type of water project is going to ever be talked about in the future, CEQA is going to be there and a huge part of that. And how CEQA laws get interpreted and used or abused or used correctly or whatever remains to be seen. But that's a huge area, and it certainly goes not just to the issue of water, but to every single type of thing we'd want to do in this state, whether it relates to energy or dealing with brownfields or dealing with low-income housing or whatever. It's a huge issue.
And actually, I've been dying to ask the questioner, since he has the same last name as the new president of France, who's a socialist, whether he is a relative. And I will look forward to running into you and talking about that. I think getting to your question about whether there's judicial intervention, the real question, there will be anybody that is a dissatisfied stakeholder that will consider whether or not to take legal action about anything that they don't agree with. That seems to also be part of the California ethic. So the question is that if we govern by inaction rather than leadership, we open ourselves up to that much more. And if we take the leadership to affirmatively make decisions, they're decisions that will have as broad a possible support as we can and will be vetted because they're affirmative decisions that are being made in a way that hopefully leaves us the least vulnerable to that kind of action. And I think that one of the reasons the Delta has been subject to so much legal action is public policy inaction. And so the question is if we can move in a way that we can do that. And one of the significant things, despite all the criticism that comes about the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, it is in part a response to that, because the legal actions were, let's take a one-off on every species. Let's sue about smelt, let's sue about salmon, even about striped bass, the subject which builds our economy through the annual Vallejo Striped Bass Festival that would be eliminated if Rex had his way. That's a very anti-business thing on his part.
That's two for you, John.
Yeah. And what the Bay Delta Conservation Plan does is take, roughly 60 species together and say, how do we deal with the habitat as its entirety in terms of restoration? And not do this as one-off, where if we, based on science in meeting the dual goals, came to a solution, that would be the best defense against what might be inevitable legal action. And so I think that's something that we have to do in terms. My congressman for many years was Leon Panetta, and at his institute, he always says the challenge of government is whether you govern by crisis or you govern by leadership. Mm-hmm. And unless, if we just wait for levees to fail or an earthquake or FEMA or all these other things, we're doing it by crisis. And we have a chance right now. That narrow window that seems to happen every generation is open on the water issues. So can we try to do something that meets as many goals of as many stakeholders as possible and get somewhere?
Three quick points. And I'm not an expert on this one, but I am fascinated by what I've read on Judge Wanger's decisions in Central Valley on water and how it started in one direction and then ended up sort of an interesting moderated position on some of his decisions. That's fascinating to me on the legal side. Second point is we've got 600 court cases on CEQA to help define CEQA. I'm one of the few people in the world that think there's so many people feeding at the trough of CEQA that will never get reformed. But where I am worried is we have no litigation, no court decisions on AB 32, SB 375, greenhouse gas, cap and trade, no court decisions on that. And we already see in transportation our AG filing a lawsuit to overturn San Diego's regional transportation plan, even though they're greenhouse gas compliant, got blessings from CARB and the whole crowd, but they're not zero greenhouse gases. I'm simplifying a very complex piece of litigation. But on CEQA, our AG is suing to overturn a transportation plan. And I wonder if that's a canary in the coal mine for whatever we try to do on water issues as well. So litigation is, again, I think I may need to change my core values from environment, sex, and add litigation as a third. I think, Secretary, you're correct.
You could probably
Yeah,
call three.
I was going to say, and they're not unrelated.
He's going to have to. I'm sorry to end the time period, but we're scheduled to have a break. I'm delighted to see that the last bit of the discussion has come back to the very human uncertainties that we have that seem to overshadow the climate changes and all the other uncertainties that we have, and that we'll have to deal with most urgently. So we'll reconvene at 11 o'clock. We'll have a very interesting panel on improving flexibility through water marketing and banking, chaired by Richard Howard. So thank you to all the panel members.